Well, we are talking today with Vance Hall, Juniper Gardens. Thank you. Juniper Gardens' first director. So thank you, first of all, for joining us. We're so happy to have you.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Can you first tell us how you got started at Juniper Gardens?
Yes, I can. I was in a doctoral program at the University of Washington, and I happened to need I minored in psychology, I majored in special ed, and I happened to need 3 more hours in psychology, and I found a place on the program that I could go to. It was at the right time of day. It was 3 hours, so I went and took that course. Never heard of the professor or anything. Happened to be Don Baer's course. And at the time I was principal of an experimental school called the Pilot School for Brain Injured and Retarded Children. And as I sat in that class and learned about recording behavior and providing systematic consequences, I realized that's something I could use in my school. And so I began working with teachers and parents, and we carried out several studies that became my doctoral dissertation. And I developed a rapport with Don Baer, and as a result of that, he introduced me to the child experimental laboratory that they had at the University of Washington, where Mont Wolf and Todd Risley worked, and I became acquainted with them. Well, these young guys were doing really great research, and they were threatening to the traditional psychologists there. And so they were not given promotions. And so the strong behavioral group there on the education faculty left. Sid Bijou went to Illinois, Don Baer went to Kansas, Todd Risley went to Florida State, Mont Wolf went to Arizona, University of Arizona. And I was still at the University of Washington. By that time, I'd gone back to my school district where I'd been principal, and they asked me to come back to the experimental ed unit at the University of Washington. But anyway, one day I got a call after these guys had dispersed. Well, I guess it was before Don had dispersed, because he said, on the phone, he said, "Vance, how would you like to go to Kansas?" I said, "Kansas? Who in the hell would want to leave Seattle and go to Kansas?" His response is, "Well, I am." And so anyway, he talked me into going out there to look into this possibility of a community research project. And he said, "We're bringing in Todd and Mont, Betty Hart." In fact, Betty Hart was still at the university, and we went on the plane. We were almost the only ones there. One reason I went is I had never been on a jet plane, and sounded like a good idea, although I told him, it's very unlikely that I'll leave Seattle. Well, when we got here, it was so exciting to talk about the possibilities and what could be done, and that, I really, really knew that these were dynamic people, and what they were going to do was going to be a great thing. But my wife had some health problems. We had a new baby, and so I was pretty sure it would be too much. So anyway, I went back home, and one day, not too long after, I got a call. It was the first community call that I'd ever had, and Todd was in Florida State and Mont in Arizona, And so we talked, and they asked me, and so I said, well, you know, it'd be so exciting to work with you guys and really do something that mattered, but I'm just not sure that I can do it. And then finally I said, well, what about you guys? And they said, well, we've decided we'll go if you go. And I was just conned into it. Next thing I knew, I was committed to come to Kansas. And so that's it. So we came here and met Dick Schiefelbusch, Fran Horowitz, head of Human Development Family Life, Harris Collingwood, an Episcopal priest that wanted to build a community center where we could design and build a preschool program. Anyway, it turned out very, very well for all of us because we were ultimately able to carry out research and to really develop Juniper Gardens. And I was frustrated at first, however, because there was somebody here, a behaviorist in the psych department, that had turned teachers off, educators off of behavior modification, as we usually called it back then. And because he said, I'm here to tell you, you don't know really what you're doing in the classroom, and that turned people off. And so when I went to schools and requested to go in and begin classroom research, I was told I couldn't do it, that they'd heard of this behavior modification. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so that first year, I helped Mont get pork rinds and pickles and things for his token reinforcement classroom, money, tickets to go skating and things like that, and to help them get the resources that they needed to work on grants and so forth. So the whole first year I wasn't able to do what I really had intended to come here to do. But Mont Wolf's after school reinforcement classroom, token reinforcement classroom with fourth grade boys and girls, I think there were a couple of girls in there, anyway, was so successful that they came from a school right next door to where his classroom program was, in the basement of the Pleasant Green Baptist Church. Al Plow, that principal, came to me and he said, I hear you want to work in classroom, do some classroom research. And I said, yes, that's true, but I've been told I can't do it. He said, well, I'll tell you, I don't care what they say down the head shed. If you want to do it, those kids have made such great progress. You come to my classroom and talk to my teachers, and if any of them are willing to work with you, you can do it. And so that's how I got a start, and carried out one of the first studies ever done in an elementary or in a public school classroom using systematic behavioral procedures. And that was going well. And but one day, under the liquor store, where my office was, in the basement of the liquor store, this big black man came, and he said to me, my name is Bert Carruthers, and I'm associate superintendent of schools here. And I thought, oh no, this is the end of my educational research. He said, I've been checking into what you've been doing. And he said, it seems like it's really working well. He said, if you ever have any trouble with anybody, you come to me. I'll be your advocate. And we never had a problem working in schools in there. And at Virgin, that's where we got Barbara Terry. She was a teacher that we worked in her classroom. She did such a great job that soon we recruited her into a master's program and the doctoral program. And that's how we found many of the people that later became graduate students working at Juniper Gardens. So anyway, that's a long series of words, but anyway, it's how it happened as I see it.
What were some of the early conversations that you alluded to some early conversations about potential for research? So what were some of those questions that you were looking at with Mott Wolf and?
Well, Mott wanted to demonstrate that if you systematically reinforce kids who weren't doing well in school to do work, do their homework, as well as reading and other basics, that it would make a difference. And he showed that those kids come after school for 2 hours really did make a difference. Their average grade went from D- at the beginning of the program to C+ by the end of the year. And so that really gave us a lot of credibility. Todd Risley and Betty Hart started preschool programs and began trying to increase acquisition of language, vocabulary, and so forth. And with some success, but that led to some of the greatest research that was done at Juniper Gardens. They decided that when the kids came to preschool, it was too late. And so they began recording in the homes of welfare mothers in what they call working class homes and in professional homes, the amount of words that were spoken to kids and the amount of words that the kids themselves said in those 3 years. And they found that the difference between poverty areas, welfare homes, and professional homes is as much as 21 million words during that span of time. And how many words they heard and how much language was used in their presence and by they themselves was a better predictor of IQ and academic success than an IQ test. So those were two of the main thrusts.
And what was the impetus for doing research within the community as opposed to in a lab or a setting in which it had been done before?
Well, that's where the kids are, for one thing. And another thing that was so important was that we were in the community. I was in the basement of the liquor store. And we hired people from the community to be observers, teachers' aides in the preschools, and aides in token reinforcement classroom. And my observers in the classroom were people from the community that we found. And I think that was very, very important. Another way it was extremely important is they became our advocates. Pretty soon I think the proprietor, C.L. Davis, the proprietor of the liquor store, labeled us KU. And pretty soon if people knew you were from KU, that was all right because we had a good name. And all the people that worked in the preschools and in our various programs, the janitor, the guy that drove the bus to take kids on field trips and stuff, became our advocates, and we were accepted in the community as a result.
So what was your vision for Juniper Gardens?
Well, I'm very, very proud that it's going on strong after 50-some years, even though I've been gone for a long time. But one thing one vision I have, and I talked to the new director about this, Brian, is I'd like to see more recruitment of African American students and more involvement with them. They're out there, but they may be hard to find, but I think it's very, very important, because I think they have a better chance of going into the black community and assisting children that are in need of professional help. So that's one of my visions.
Sure. And so when you were establishing Juniper Gardens, that was part of your vision, was to sort of build up the community by involving the community. Is that correct?
Yes, and we were lucky at that time. Some of our first money came from the Office of Economic Opportunity. And in order to get opportunity money, you had to have community support. And there was a group called the NAG, Neighborhood Action Group here, and really fine leaders from the community. Chester Owens, Uriel Owens, Noah Kirkwood, a number of others who understood and advocated for us, and they saw the possibility if we came in and worked with children. They also asked us some tough questions to make sure that they said, oh, are you going to be like most of those programs where they go and get their data and they leave? And we convinced them we're going to stay. I guess after 4 years? Mm-hmm. It's true, we did stay. Maybe not under the liquor store, but close by.
Sure. And so, in addition to sort of overcoming the challenges like you were just describing, what other barriers did you encounter?
Well, one was over facilities. Our first programs were in the community center at the Juniper Gardens Housing Project, and Pleasant Green Baptist Church, and another church on 3rd Street nearby. And but we needed offices, and we needed a secure space because we had electric typewriters and stuff. I don't think we had any computers. It was before computers really were pervasive. And we were concerned about break-ins and so forth. And C.L. Davis's place had bars on the windows and everything, and that was appealing to us. So we went and investigated. Yeah, he would rent the downstairs of his liquor store, and it looked like good space for us. And when the Baptist ministers, or the other ministers, not just Baptists, but the ministerial group, heard about that, they said, you mean you're going to take kids in the basement of the liquor store? So we promised, no, we wouldn't do that, but that was a secure place for our offices. And they really were adamant that we shouldn't be there. But we stuck by our guns and contracted to use that space. And we found out later that some of the young Turks in the community, Uriel Owens, John Burris, some of the NAG group, said if we had given in to them, they would have made sure that we didn't continue.
Really?
And so that stand made a difference, that we were, we knew what we were doing and what we needed, and that gave us credibility.
That's interesting. So why is that, do you think?
What?
Why is it that they wouldn't have let you to continue if you hadn't?
Well, they wanted us to rent office space in their buildings.
From them, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What did it take to attract researchers to come work?
What?
What did it take to attract researchers to come in?
Well, we were on the cutting edge we the first study that I published was the first study of using behavior analysis in a public school classroom. It was on the first page of the first volume of applied behavior analysis. In fact, to show that we were on the cutting edge, I have 4 different articles that are on page 1, number 1 of the first journal of that kind. That was one thing that happened. So we got a reputation, and of course, Don Bear and Todd Risley and Mont Wolf were very quickly looked up to as top people, and soon we got all kinds of applications, and people wanted to come here and study. Lawrence became a mecca for behavioral psychology, behavior analysis, and so that reputation became such that we had all kinds of applications and they were top people. One screening thing I used was to tell people if they wanted to come that they couldn't come, that I didn't have support for them. If they insisted on coming anyway, because they heard about Juniper Gardens, then that was a barrier that they had to overcome. Second thing I did was to have a couple of my current students go with them to Lawrence and show them around the campus. When they came back, I asked them, do you think you can work with this guy or this gal? If they said no, he was true. If they said yes, then that was a big step forward. I never looked at GED records, but I looked at their work record. What had they done? What were their recommendations from wherever they had been working? And those were critical steps for a graduate student to come work.
Mm-hmm. So after this initial phase of work, were there challenges associated with keeping this place running?
Of course, and fortunately we had Dick Schiefelbusch. He was a master at site visits. He had a history. He had taken a lot of debate, I guess, in high school and college. He could listen, understand what the question was, and respond to it. Mont and Todd were really good at it too. So that gave us a real opportunity to be a grant center. And pretty soon, everybody that opposed was competing with us for grants were using references to Juniper Gardens, so it gave us a leg up. And that made a real difference, I think.
What kinds of venues was Dick going into where he was defending the work?
Well, he had a way of letting them know how important it was to this community, as well as highlighting. We had data to show, and but Dick was instrumental, I think, in we learned from him, and pretty soon some of the rest of us were pretty good at site visits as well.
So how did the research begin to evolve from that point?
Oh, that's interesting. You know, when Todd, for example, came here, he had to have a pigeon lab because he'd been used to doing that at the University of Washington, you know, like Skinner's pigeons and so forth. And he thought that was something he really wanted to do. But after a year or so, he realized it was much more interesting and more important to focus on working with kids and carrying out the programs. And, and well, let me give you an example of the kind of thing, how how research developed. Alva Beasley was a parent whose son was having a lot of trouble with spelling. And some way we got word of it, and Marcia Broden, my first research assistant, went in and worked with Derek, her son, and Alva, and set up a program so that he wrote, mother gave him the spelling words, and he would write them. If he got it right, he got, I think, 2 points. If he got it wrong, then she would correct him, have him spell it 3 times, and he'd get 1 point for that. So he tried to get as many points as he could. And the reason, so he wrote words, and then once he'd written them, he wrote them again and again during the 10 or 15 minute after school tutoring program. And the reason that Marcia devised that was that we'd done observations in the classrooms, elementary school classroom, and we realized that some kids wrote them when they were tested on Monday. You probably remember how you used to do that. And then some of those kids never ever wrote those words again until Friday. They maybe divided them in syllables, did other kinds of things, but they didn't really practice spelling those words. And so this vastly increased the practice of spelling. And it was very, very successful. Soon he got 100 on his spelling test every week. And also we realized Alva was a very bright gal and recruited her, and she became part of the Juniper Gardens staff here, as you well know. Well, Joe Del Quadri, another graduate student, saw what she had done, and the light went off, and he said, I'm going to do that in a full classroom. So he took, I think, a 4th grade class, divided up into half, had 2 teams, and then had kids within the team give words to each other and correct and use the same kind of procedure. If they made a mistake, they had to rewrite them and write those words several times during every spelling period. We had classrooms, 4th grade classrooms of the inner city. Everyone got 100 on the Friday test. I taught 5th grade in an upper middle class area in Seattle. I never ever had everyone get 100 on the spelling test. So it was class-wide peer tutoring that Joe helped develop, and then transferred into reading. Same kind of procedure to increase the amount of reading kids did in the classroom. So you see, one thing led to another, and that happened over and over.
That is a good gateway to sort of the next question about how, or who do you consider to be some of the most important people in Juniper Gardens history?
Dick Schiefelbusch, Mount Wolf, Todd Risley, Betty Hart. And then I think, in a way, some of the grad students that went out, we had students that became leaders in communities all across the country and other places. The director of special ed in Panama was one of our students. The head of the psych department of the University of Mexico was from Juniper Gardens. The director of special ed at the University of Texas, the largest special ed faculty in the country, was Herb Reith, one of our people that not only as a graduate student, but stayed on here and directed programs here. Marion Panion, Director of Special Education at Drake University. Ace Gosart, Director of Special Education in Nevada, in Wyoming, University of Wyoming. And over and over and over, they've gone out and had an influence. Stuart McNaughton in New Zealand, I just visited him this year. And so I think by extension, those are really important people that were here at Juniper Gardens. And of course, there are many more.
Mm-hmm. How about some of the most pivotal events in the history of Juniper? So if we could maybe start with, getting access to that office space in the basement of the liquor
Yes.
store, that being an example of
Yes.
one.
Yes, and I think, for me, finally getting into the classroom after a year. And again, that was a outcome of doing a good job in another program. Mont Wolf was the one really that was the key for me to get in to do what I came here to do. And I think too, one thing that was pivotal in our first big site visit, that for an NICHD program project grant, we thought we were doing okay, but at one point we had them visit with our advisory committee, community advisory committee. And so they went in with and everybody on our advisory committee was African American. They went in with them, and when they came out, it was all over. We knew we were going to get the grant. In fact, one guy said, and back then this is lingo I understand, he said, "I'll sure like to trade you ghettos." He was from the Chicago area. And because we had the support of the community, that was critical. I don't think we would have continued if we hadn't gotten that program project grant that undergirded us for years to come.
I'm wondering if you might be able to describe sort of the timeline of your research or sort of the trajectory of your research while you were here.
Well, I began in 1966, I guess, the fall of 1966. And it was interesting because it started with one classroom, and it was in a classroom with a very disruptive student named Robbie. Everyone knew about Robbie, and because of our program to get the teacher to attend him when he was studying, when he was appropriate, and he quit being a menace in that classroom. Pretty soon other teachers said, "I've got this kid in my classroom, would you like to come and work with him?" And so we did that, and pretty soon a school psychologist asked if he could be involved, and we said of course. And we were invited by another principal to go into his building, and so in this way it just generated more and more opportunities to do the kind of research that we wanted to do. So we developed a reputation. And one thing that happened was fortuitous, was that I was asked to teach a class. I had a class at the Med Center, and I had taught a group of principals and teachers here in this community of 9 to how to measure behavior, how to use systematic principles. And it was quite successful. In fact, I think the word went out, and the Dick Whalen, the director of special ed, asked me if I would teach a bigger class at the Med Center. And I said, yes, but no more than 40. No more than 40. Well, it so happened they registered 40 here and 40 in Lawrence, so I was faced with 80. And I figured out, well, the thing that had been so successful with the 9 was that they reported on and saw what each were doing. So I went and got a bunch of those, 8 of those people that had taken the course, and asked them to be directors of a group in this big course, and I broke them into groups of 10. So we had 8 groups of 10. And so after the lecture, they went and discussed and took the quiz and graded the quiz that I gave every day, and it was successful. The next semester I had 100 students show up. So it really had an impact, because now teachers were learning this and getting credit for it, and so that developed. Well, I decided I should have some manuals written that they could use, which told about how to measure behavior, how to use consequences, and so forth. So I wrote some manuals, but I couldn't get a publisher. But there was a guy named Bob Hoyt, who's a journalist at the Bureau of Child Research in Lawrence, and I'd gotten acquainted with him because he had made a film about Juniper Gardens. So we published them. These very primitive booklets, and sold them for $1 a piece. And anyway, those were our manuals for teaching my class. Pretty soon they were selling, and the next thing we knew, other people were sending us behaviorists that we'd been acquainted with were sending us manuscripts, and the next thing I knew, the H&H Enterprises was born, a publishing company that Bob and I had, which we operated out of our homes at first, and it became really a very successful operation. Finally was bought by ProEd down in Austin, and some of our publications are still in print. So many people have been introduced to behavior analysis through those booklets. 3 of them have sold over 750,000 copies because they've been used by my students and other people's students in classrooms all across the country.
I had a quick question, Vance, about it's related to earlier. I was just curious what the dynamic was like when you all first got here between, like you had you and you had Todd and you had Mont. Like what did that look like in that first early?
Well, actually, there was a director before me.
Oh, okay.
A local guy, and he was a great guy. And he helped get us entree in the program. But for whatever reason, it was threatening to him that Todd, especially Todd and Mont, would make demands. He wanted pork rinds, he needed all this stuff for his classroom. Todd was a pretty confrontational person sometimes, and they didn't hit it off. And so that first year, a lot of my energy was expended in trying to bridge the gap between Fred and Mont and Todd. Also, well, just almost everybody, Betty didn't get along with him either. So that was part of the dynamic that Dick did all he could to help bridge that gap to Dick Schiefelbusch. But so finally, Fred decided that he didn't want to continue, and so I became the director instead of just assistant director. And but once that bridge was over, we all got along pretty well.
Yeah.
So.
What did it feel like to work in that environment?
Well, it was hectic. Let me give you an example of something I learned. I learned a lot from observing this thing going on. And one day I was down in the office at the Med Center where the director had his office, and he got a call from Todd Risley. Todd Risley needed some money, the director responded. He said, "I can't do that." "What do you mean? You're always making demands that are just not possible," or words to that effect. And finally, Todd hung up on him. What did the director do? He sat there for a minute, said something about Todd, not too complimentary, picked up the phone, called the dean at the Med Center, asked for what Todd wanted, got it. Called back Todd and told him he'd managed to get it. Todd still hated him because he didn't get credit. He didn't get credit for what he did. I never ever told anybody I couldn't do it from then on. I said, I'll do what I can. And lots of times I was able to do things that I didn't realize that were possible. So those are just kind of things that happen, I think, sometimes when you're on the cutting edge and pressing the boundaries as we were at that time.
So you've mentioned, being on that cutting edge, and so you were kind of on this boat on your own. What was sort of the social atmosphere in that working environment like? Because you were kind of cut off from other people.
No, we were very much together. And we were very much supported by the departments, Human Development, Family Life. They came to me and I got appointments. I was so naive at that time because I'd just been in public schools. When I was first asked if I wanted an appointment, I said, no, I'm fine with appointment to the Bureau of Child Research. But it soon became obvious to me, especially when I had students begin coming and say, could I study with you? So I was given appointments in special ed and human development, family life. And that was critical in my development as well as development of education opportunities for graduate students at Juniper.
So this is jumping forward a little bit, but can you describe the process of, when you were ready to sort of hand on the reins to someone else, how you knew that the person was the right person?
I knew. Charlie, I never had a computer until I retired. Betty and Alva worked on the computers. But Charlie was very much into computers, and he'd been here for quite a while. He'd come from Oregon, along with Joe Quadri. And over time, it became obvious to me that we needed a strong leader if Juniper Gardens was going to continue, and someone that would be committed here. And about the time I was thinking about being ready to retire, Charlie was being recruited very much by Oregon and Utah State universities to come to their programs. And so I realized that he was might very likely go. So I went to Dick Schievelbusch, and I said, Dick, I've been here almost 25 years, and I'm going to take a sabbatical, informal sabbatical. And so that's what I did. No one except Dick really approved of it, I guess. And so I went and played golf and did a lot of other things, but I didn't come here very often. And Charlie was in charge. And because I wanted him to know that and have the experience of being in charge. So when my sabbatical was over, I never took over again. That was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I would sit in the meetings. I usually felt like I knew what was going to happen within 15 minutes, but I kept my mouth shut. And I did work. I continued to carry out research and everything, but Charlie was the director. And so in a couple of years then, also I got an academic appointment for him. So he knew that he really would be director and would be, and I think that was an important process, and that made the transition go pretty smoothly. And of course, he's done a wonderful job. He went on beyond where we were when I was here.
And then we still have some more questions too, of course, but what would you, what kind of advice or what would you tell the newer generation of investigators here at Juniper?
Good work. Do good work. Yeah. I just think that one thing, and I think that's still true here at Juniper Gardens, we were non-competitive. People participated in each other's research. When I went to the University of Washington, I was full-time working, carrying an overload, new baby, wife with bad health, and I had no time to socialize with the other students. And I realized right at the end when I was invited to Phi Delta Kappa educational honorary and went to a couple of meetings, these guys talked about issues and interacted with each other, and I realized I'd missed out on all that. And so I decided when I came here that was going to happen to my students. And the fact that we were here and Lawrence campus is 35 miles down the highway, I decided to do something about that. So I started an informal seminar. And on Friday, after teaching a class, Friday evening, we went to Jimmy's Jigger. Class was taught in, my class was taught in at the Med Center. We went to Jimmy's Jigger next door, had beer and pizza, and talked about issues. And that's where my students presented the research that they were going to do, and the other students critiqued it, and it became a marvelous. In fact, this happened before too long. Students from Lawrence that weren't my students were coming to our informal seminar, probably for the pizza, but it was a really generative things that my students still talk about. It was the importance of that, and it got them so they were in this environment where they were helping each other. It was non-competitive, and I think Louis L'Enfant from Canada, who recently passed, as a matter of fact, was the first one to tell me. He said, Vance, do you realize there's no place like Juniper Gardens? I said, oh yeah, Louis. Yeah, such great, he's a French Canadian. You have such great, he said, no, you don't realize there's no place like Juniper Gardens. And since then, after 2 or 3 other students told me that, I realized there's no place like Juniper Gardens.
So how can future investigators get to that place? So what do you think was so important? Was it the combination of the collegiality and the work?
I think so. It was important. It was exciting. You could see the changes in behavior, and they helped each other. They, you know, everybody. It was a team. Became a really great team, I think, and that was just carried on. And I was fortunate in that people like Herb, Joe DeClarde, Barb, Terry stayed here, and so they had been used to that kind of a thing. Dale Walker, they'd been used to that kind of a, what would you say, kind of a
environment.
What?
Environment.
Yeah, of being a team together, and so they carried that on. And of course, Charlie was important. Charlie and Judy too were an important part of that.
So you mentioned that the Juniper, the uniqueness of it. So, and it sounds like it's around the team and around cutting edge and this connection to the community. Are there other aspects of, this organization you think that make it different than, what you hear, what your thoughts are on other places that are doing research?
One thing that I think happened when I first published research, I was invited to conferences and ABBA and APA and all these different things, CEC, and gave lots of talks, and then to many universities. And I was doing this a couple of times a month. Well, eventually that got old. And so when someone would call, I say, well, I made it harder and harder for them, charge more and more for a retainer. But after a while, I said, I've got this great student, and he really knows a lot about this. I think you ought to have him come, because I'm booked, I can't make it. And so my students went out and gave the presentations. And also, I think that was important, and Mont and Todd did the same thing, that if a student carried out the research, they were the first author on the research. And they had the opportunities to go and make these presentations. Well, that looked pretty good on their vita. And if they went to compete for a position, they were way ahead of most graduate students right out, because they published, they presented at conferences, they'd been, even some of them had written grants, and so it gave us a real leg up, and they got these good positions all across the country. Yeah. I think that was important.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Is there, I think this is our last question here, unless you want to talk about location. But what do you think is the most important work that is a part of Juniper's legacy that should continue on into the future?
Yeah. Well, I think language development. Betty Hart and Todd Risley, that Dale and others are continuing here. I think programs of autism, the work that Eric Larson is doing in Minnesota is incredible. He has data to show, using behavioral procedures, that of 46 kids that were in their intensive program, 37 are no longer considered autistic. It's an incredible program, but a very intensive program that he had to sell to the legislature, but it's paying real dividends there. So, and I think also Mont Wolf developed the token reinforcement program. It was developed by Boys Town. And now the Boys Town are using that all over the country as other group homes. It's the leading approach to serving group home clients all across the country. That came from Juniper Gardens originally, from this token reinforcement classroom. So I think those are major thrusts that started at Juniper Gardens that are having an effect across the country.
Well, is there anything?
I'm gonna go
else?
grab.
Do you want to take a short break?
Or you want a
Well,
break,
just want
or-
to say thank you. This
Yeah,
has been
yeah,
fascinating.
What?
This has been fascinating, and
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, it's great.